After my ex-wife left me drowning in manufactured debt and sleeping in my freezing car, I worked 3 back-breaking jobs for years just to survive. At our town reunion, she looked at my cheap suit, smirked, and asked if I was still a nobody. That was right before the CEO of her new company walked onto the stage, stepped directly down to me, shook my hand in front of a dead-silent room, and said, "Welcome, boss. The acquisition is complete. My name is Thomas. I am 38 years old, and I am about to tell you how the most humiliating betrayal of my life became the ultimate weapon. But to understand how I bought the very company that destroyed me, you have to understand exactly how they tore my life apart." It started on a Friday afternoon in November. I had spent the last 9 years as a mid-level logistics manager for a regional supply chain company in Ohio. It was not a glamorous job. I worked 50 hours a week optimizing shipping routes, managing warehouse schedules, and keeping my head down. But it was honest work, and it paid the mortgage on the 4-bedroom suburban house my wife Sarah and I shared. Or at least I thought it did. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, an emergency company-wide email summoned my entire department to the main conference room. We walked in to find our department head packing his briefcase, his face pale, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Standing at the front of the room was a team of lawyers in tailored suits flanked by corporate security guards. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped up to the podium. He did not introduce himself, but we all knew exactly who he was. Richard Sterling. He was a senior executive for Sterling Tech, a massive $2 billion conglomerate that had been quietly buying up local supply chains and gutting them for parts. Richard was known for 2 things in the corporate world: his ruthless efficiency and his absolute lack of empathy. He stood at the podium looking down at us as if we were nothing more than an inconvenient math problem he had just solved. "Sterling Tech has officially acquired this company," Richard said, his voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "As of this exact minute, your department is considered a redundancy. Your employment is terminated effectively immediately. Security will escort you to your desks to collect your personal items. You have 10 minutes to exit the building." There was no severance package. There was no transition period. 9 years of my life wiped out by a man who looked actively annoyed that the announcement was cutting into his weekend golf schedule. I walked out of that building in a complete daze, carrying a cardboard box containing a cheap coffee mug and a framed picture of Sarah. I sat in my car in this parking lot for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The cold November wind rattled the windows of my 10-year-old sedan, but I barely felt it. I kept staring at the photo of my wife. Sarah was beautiful, highly ambitious, and accustomed to a certain standard of living. I had spent our entire 7-year marriage trying to provide that standard, constantly stretching my paycheck to cover her expensive tastes. I dreaded telling her the news. I dreaded the look of profound disappointment I knew would wash over her face. I drove home slowly, trying to rehearse how I would break it to her. I tried to convince myself that we would figure it out together, that this was just a temporary setback. But when I pulled into our driveway, my stomach dropped. Something was entirely wrong. Sarah's car was parked on the front lawn instead of the garage, and the trunk was wide open. I left my box in the car and hurried through the front door, calling her name. The house was a complete disaster area. Drawers were pulled open, closet doors were flung wide, and expensive clothes were piled everywhere. I found Sarah in the master bedroom. She was zipping up a massive designer suitcase. She did not even look up when I walked in. "Sarah, what is going on?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "I just got laid off. The whole company got bought out and liquidated today. We need to sit down and talk about our finances." Sarah finally stopped packing. She turned to look at me, and her expression chilled me to the bone. There was no shock. There was no sympathy. There was no fear about the future. There was only cold, calculated impatience. "I know," Sarah said, her voice perfectly calm. "I knew it was happening 3 weeks ago." I stared at her, completely unable to process what she was saying. "How could you possibly know that the buyout was a strictly guarded corporate secret until 2 hours ago?" Sarah walked over to her mahogany dresser, picked up a thick manila folder, and dropped it right onto my chest. I scrambled to catch it before it hit the floor. You want to talk about finances, Thomas? Open it. My hand shook as I opened the folder. Inside was a massive stack of credit card statements, personal loan agreements, and second mortgage documents. Every single one of them was in my name. I flipped through the pages, my vision blurring as I read the totals. $30,000 on a platinum card, $40,000 in a high-interest private loan, a massive line of credit taken out against the equity of our house. I saw charges for first-class flights to Miami luxury hotels in Aspen and diamond jewelry. These were all places Sarah had gone on what she claimed were solo weekend retreats to clear her head. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of the numbers. "I never opened these accounts. I never signed for these loans." "You leave your documents everywhere, Thomas," Sarah replied smoothly, checking her makeup in the mirror as if we were discussing the weather. "You are careless. You never pay attention to the mail. It was remarkably easy to secure those lines of credit to maintain the lifestyle I actually deserve. And since we are legally married and the accounts are strictly in your name, the debt belongs entirely to you." The room started to spin. I could not catch my breath. She had forged my signature. She had secretly drained the equity from our home and racked up over $100,000 in debt, all while pretending we were happily living within our means. "Why would you do this?" I stepped toward her, holding the folder like it was a live grenade. "This will completely ruin us. I do not have a job anymore. It will ruin you," Sarah corrected, finally turning to face me fully. "I am leaving you, Thomas. I am filing for divorce first thing Monday morning." I stood there paralyzed. The woman I had loved and supported had just handed me a financial death sentence and told me she was walking out the door without a second thought. "Where are you going?" I asked, the fight completely draining out of me. Sarah smiled. It was the same cruel, mocking smile she used to give waiters when they got her order wrong. She picked up her designer purse and slipped her phone into her pocket. "Richard is sending a private car for me," she said. I froze. The name hung in the air like a physical weight suffocating the oxygen out of the room. Richard Sterling." "He is a real man, Thomas," Sarah said, grabbing the handle of her suitcase and rolling it past me toward the door. "He is an executive. He builds empires. You just load trucks for a living. Or I guess you used to. Richard told me he was going to personally liquidate your department today. It was his little wedding present to me." She paused in the doorway and looked back at me one last time, taking in my cheap suit and my pale, devastated face. "Enjoy the debt, Thomas," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "Try not to lose the house before the bank takes it." She walked down the hallway, the wheels of her suitcase clicking against the hardwood floor. A minute later, I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. I stood completely alone in our empty bedroom, holding a folder of forged debt. My career destroyed, my marriage revealed as a predatory lie, and my entire life reduced to absolute zero by the man who had just stolen my wife. Sunday mornings in our quiet Ohio suburb always followed a strict routine. I woke up on the sagging mattress of a cheap motel on the edge of town, staring at a brown water stain on the ceiling. 48 hours had passed since I lost my career, my marriage and my financial future in a single devastating afternoon. The massive debt Sarah forged in my name hung over me like a physical weight. My bank accounts were completely frozen. I had exactly $42 in my wallet, and my 10-year-old sedan was running on fumes. I was desperate for guidance. I needed the community I had been a loyal part of for 7 long years. I put on my only clean suit, splashed cold water on my face, and drove to Grace Fellowship, the church where Sarah and I were married. The parking lot was filled with familiar cars. These were people I grilled burgers with on the 4th of July. These were the men I played softball with every spring, and the families I had helped move into their new homes. I walked up the stone steps, seeking just one sympathetic face. Someone who might offer a word of advice or a temporary job lead to help me survive the week. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the warm sanctuary. The organ music was softly playing, and the morning light filtered beautifully through the tall, stained glass windows. I took a deep breath and walked down the center aisle toward the 3rd row on the left. That was our family pew. We had sat there every Sunday for 7 years. It was the only place left in the world that felt like home. But before I could reach the wooden bench, a heavy hand slammed flat against my chest, stopping me dead in my tracks. I looked up. Standing in the aisle, completely blocking my path with his broad shoulders, was Greg. Greg was the older brother of Sarah. He was a prominent local real estate attorney, the kind of man who wore custom-tailored Italian suits to a casual Sunday service and made sure everyone in town knew exactly how much he donated to the church building fund. He glared down at me, his jaw set tight, his eyes cold and calculating. "You do not belong here, Thomas," Greg said. His voice was not a private whisper. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring that the rows in front of us and behind us heard every single word. Heads began to turn immediately. The quiet murmurs of Sunday morning conversations stopped. The sanctuary grew uncomfortably silent. "Greg, please step aside," I said, keeping my hands firmly at my sides, refusing to cause a scene. "I just want to sit down and attend the service. I've been through absolute hell this weekend. I just need a moment of peace." Greg let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed harshly off the vaulted ceiling. "Peace? You honestly think you deserve peace after what you put my sister through? You are a financial parasite, Thomas. You hid massive debts from her. You lost your pathetic little warehouse job because you are incompetent. You dragged Sarah down for years, and now you have the nerve to show your face in our church and play the victim." The words hit me like physical blows to the stomach. The congregation was completely silent now, watching the spectacle unfold. These were my friends, or so I had foolishly thought. I looked around the large room, making direct eye contact with the men I played softball with, the couples we had hosted for dinner in our home. Not a single person stood up. Not a single person spoke a word to defend me. They just looked away, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their faces full of pity and judgment. Greg had already reached them. He was a ruthless lawyer. He knew exactly how to spin a narrative to protect his sister and destroy my reputation. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You have nothing, Thomas. You are completely unemployed. You are drowning in debt that you recklessly created. You are a complete failure as a husband and as a man. Do not ever approach my family again. Now turn around and walk out those doors before I have the deacons throw you out into the street for trespassing." I stood there paralyzed, my face burning with absolute humiliation. My entire social circle was watching me be verbally destroyed, and they were letting it happen. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to shout the truth about the forged credit cards and the sudden corporate buyout, but the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open. The bright morning light poured in, blinding me for a second. Walking down the center aisle was Sarah. She was wearing a stunning new designer dress that cost more than my monthly salary. But she was not walking alone. Her arm was linked tightly with a man wearing a sharp charcoal suit and a luxury watch, Richard Sterling, the billionaire executive who had liquidated my department on Friday, the man who had stolen my wife. They walked down the aisle together, looking like local royalty holding court. Richard carried himself with the effortless arrogance of a man who owned the world and everyone in it. Sarah looked radiant, completely unbothered by the fact that she had financially ruined me and abandoned our marriage just 2 days prior. As they walked past me, she did not even look at my face. She looked right through me as if I was just an empty, worthless space in the room. Richard gave me a brief, dismissive smirk, the kind of look a man gives a stray dog blocking his path. Greg immediately stepped aside for them, his aggressive and threatening demeanor dissolving instantly into an eager, fawning smile. He shook the hand of Richard with absolute reverence, bowing his head slightly. "Richard, we are so incredibly glad you could make it this morning," Greg said loudly, completely ignoring my presence now. "We saved you the best seat." They slid into the third row on the left, taking the exact spot where I had sat for 7 years. I was entirely replaced. In less than 48 hours, they had taken my career, my home, my finances, and now, my community. I looked at the faces of the congregation one last time. People I had known for years were now actively smiling and nodding at Richard, eager to gain the favor and attention of a wealthy corporate titan. The betrayal was absolute and sickening. I realized then that I had no friends in that room. I had no family. I had absolutely nothing. I turned around and walked back down the long center aisle, the sound of my cheap shoes echoing loudly on the hardwood floor with every step. The heavy doors closed shut behind me, shutting me out in the cold morning air. I walked across the asphalt to my 10-year-old sedan, got inside and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and my hands ached. They had completely isolated me. They wanted me broken, destitute, and humiliated. They wanted me to crawl away and disappear. But as I sat in that empty parking lot staring at the brick walls of the church that had just rejected me, the crushing weight of their betrayal hardened into something entirely different. I was at the absolute bottom, but I promised myself right then and there that I would survive this storm, and I would make them deeply regret the day they decided to leave me with nothing. The legal assault began before the sun even came up on Monday morning. I had barely slept in my cheap motel room, my mind replaying the humiliation at the church when my phone started ringing. It was not a friend checking in. It was a local process server. By noon, I was sitting across from a court clerk staring at a stack of documents that made no logical sense. Greg had not just helped Sarah file for divorce. He had engineered a financial execution. Using aggressive real estate connections and obscure legal loopholes, he filed an emergency injunction against me. The manufactured credit card debt and the second mortgages Sarah had secretly opened were weaponized instantly. Greg argued to a sympathetic local judge that I was a flight risk and a financial liability who was actively destroying marital assets. It was a complete fabrication, but Greg had the paperwork to make it look entirely legitimate. Because my bank accounts were frozen and my sudden unemployment left me without income, I could not retain a lawyer to defend myself. Greg essentially convinced the court to force an immediate sale of the house to cover the fraudulent debts granting Sarah temporary possession. They did not even give me 24 hours to gather my life. On Tuesday afternoon, 2 county sheriff deputies knocked loudly on the front door of the 4-bedroom suburban house I had spent 7 years paying for. Greg was standing right behind them on the porch, wearing a smug, expensive tailored suit and perfectly polished leather shoes. He handed me a court-ordered eviction notice with a smile that made my blood run cold. I was officially a trespasser in my own home. I was given exactly 30 minutes to pack whatever personal belongings I could safely carry. I walked through the empty rooms, throwing clothes into black trash bags because Sarah had taken all the actual luggage. Every wall, every fixture, every memory in that house felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I had worked 50 hours a week for nearly a decade to keep a roof over our heads. Now I was being thrown out into the street like common garbage. Greg watched me the entire time, leaning against the doorframe of the master bedroom, checking his luxury watch and loudly reminding the deputies that my time was almost completely used up. I dragged the heavy trash bags out to the driveway and shoved them into the back seat of my 10-year-old sedan. The neighborhood was dead quiet, but I could see the curtains twitching in the houses across the street. People I had known for years were watching me get evicted, too afraid or too indifferent to step outside and say a single word. I got into the driver's seat, turned the key, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. My entire existence was now reduced to a few bags of clothes and a car running on fumes. With my bank accounts locked and the $42 in my wallet almost gone after paying for gas, a motel was no longer an option. That night, I drove to a massive 24-hour retail parking lot on the industrial edge of town. The temperature dropped rapidly as a bitter November wind swept across the endless stretch of asphalt. I parked under a flickering yellow street lamp, hoping the light would keep away anyone looking for trouble. I turned off the engine to save gas and wrapped myself in a thin wool blanket I had grabbed from the closet. Sleeping in a car is nothing like you see in movies. There is no comfort, no peace, and absolutely no warmth. The cold seeped through the metal doors and settled deep into my bones. Every time a delivery truck rattled past or a stray shopping cart slammed into a curb, my eyes shot open. My back ached terribly against the worn fabric of the driver's seat. I stared up at the frost forming on the inside of the windshield and felt a crushing wave of despair. I was a grown man with a college degree freezing in a parking lot, but as the longest night of my life finally gave way to a pale gray dawn, the despair began to harden into something entirely different. I watched the early morning commuters pull into the parking lot holding their hot coffees and complaining about their ordinary days. I realized nobody was coming to save me. Greg and Sarah wanted me to break. They wanted me to crawl into a corner and disappear so they could enjoy their stolen wealth without guilt. If I wanted to survive, I had to swallow every single ounce of my remaining pride and get to work. I drove to a local staffing agency right when their doors opened. I did not mention my background in logistics or my years of corporate management. I knew those qualifications would only invite questions I could not answer. I told the receptionist I needed immediate cash and was willing to do absolutely anything. 2 hours later, I walked out with a uniform and a schedule. I had just traded my middle management career for a minimum wage graveyard shift as a commercial janitor. It was brutal, exhausting physical labor, but it meant a steady paycheck and a warm building tonight. My first shift started at midnight in a massive corporate office building downtown. While Richard Sterling and my ex-wife slept in luxury, I was pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket down an endless silent corridor. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I scrubbed scuff marks off the polished linoleum floors. I emptied overflowing trash cans, cleaned the executive restrooms, and hauled heavy bags of garbage out to the freezing alleyway. My hands blistered and my shoulders screamed in pain. It was the bottom of the social ladder, but every sweep of the mop was keeping me alive. The graveyard shift as a commercial janitor ended at 6 a.m, but my day was just beginning. I would walk out of that freezing office building and drive straight to an Amazon fulfillment warehouse. Just 3 days earlier, I had been a mid-level logistics manager making high-level decisions about these supply chains. Now I was wearing a high-visibility vest, standing on a concrete loading dock, manually hauling wooden pallets for $14 an hour. My shoulders screamed with every heavy box I lifted. My knees throbbed from standing on solid concrete, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological torture of the debt. Sarah had left me with over $100,000 in forged credit cards and private loans. Because the accounts were legally in my name, the interest was compounding daily. If I missed the payments, the banks would garnish my wages, or worse, send me to jail for the fraudulent activity she had orchestrated. I had no choice but to keep moving. I worked the warehouse shift until 3 p.m, bought a cup of black coffee, and drove back to the Walmart parking lot. I would set the alarm on my phone for exactly 2 hours, recline the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan, and pass out from pure exhaustion. At 5 p.m, my alarm would scream. I would splash cold water onto my face, put on a clean shirt, and turn on the rideshare app. This was my third job. From sunset until nearly midnight, I drove strangers around the city I used to call home. Every passenger was a painful reminder of the life that had just been violently stolen from me. I kept my head down, agreed with whatever they said, and prayed my car engine would not break down. Every dollar went directly to the fraudulent debt. I was trapped in an endless cycle of labor, functioning on less than 4 hours of sleep a day. The breaking point came on a Friday night. A massive thunderstorm had flooded the streets, driving up the surge pricing on the app. I was exhausted, but the extra money was too desperately needed to ignore. The app pinged with a premium pickup request at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I drove through the blinding rain, pulled up to the velvet ropes outside the restaurant, and unlocked the doors. A man in a bespoke wool overcoat slid onto the back seat, bringing the smell of expensive cologne into my damp car. He was holding a large steaming cup of premium coffee. I put the car in drive and confirmed the destination without turning around. "Taking you to the Oakwood Estates, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "Is the route acceptable?" The passenger froze. The silence in the back of the car became suddenly heavy. I looked up into the rearview mirror. Staring back at me with a look of absolute incredulity that rapidly morphed into a vicious smirk was Greg. My ex-brother-in-law leaned forward, pushing his face close to the plastic divider. He let out a sharp laugh. "Well, this is absolutely priceless," Greg said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Thomas, the great logistics manager, reduced to chauffeuring me home in a 10-year-old rust bucket. I knew you were struggling to pay those massive debts you hid from my sister, but I did not realize you had sunk to this level of desperation." My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. I focused entirely on the road. "I am just doing my job, Greg. I am completing the ride. Sit back and put your seatbelt on." "Oh, you do not get to give me orders, Thomas," Greg sneered. "You work for me right now. I am the paying customer. You are just the help. Honestly, this car smells like wet dog and desperation. No wonder Sarah left you for a man who actually owns the buildings he walks into." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I needed the $20 this ride would pay. I stayed completely silent, navigating the flooded streets, letting him hurl insult after insult for 20 agonizing minutes. He mocked my clothes. He mocked the eviction he had orchestrated. He openly bragged about how Richard Sterling was flying Sarah to Paris. When I finally pulled up to his massive luxury home, I put the car in park and unlocked the doors. "We have arrived," I said, staring straight ahead. Greg did not move. I heard the rustle of his coat, and then I felt a sudden searing heat across my right shoulder. I gasped, twisting around in my seat. Greg had taken the lid off his large coffee and deliberately poured the scalding dark liquid directly over my right shoulder, letting it soak through my only clean shirt. "Oops," Greg said, his eyes entirely dead. "The ride was a little bumpy. You should really learn how to drive smoothly, Thomas. It is bad for your customer service." He threw the empty cup onto the floor mats, stepped out into the rain, and slammed the heavy door shut. I sat there trembling in the freezing car, the scalding coffee burning my skin. The rideshare app on my dashboard chimed a moment later. A notification flashed across the screen. Greg had left me a 1-star rating. Under the comment section, he had typed exactly 3 words: "Know your place." I stared at those words until the screen went dark. The physical pain of the burn was nothing compared to the absolute degradation of the moment. They were not just trying to take my money. They were actively trying to break my spirit. I wiped the coffee off my shoulder with a fast food napkin, gripping the steering wheel until my hands went numb. I was at the absolute bottom of the world, but as I sat in the darkness, the humiliation calcified into something unbreakable. I pulled away from the gates, promising myself that they would eventually pay for every drop of this suffering. 3 weeks into living in my freezing car, my phone rang while I was scrubbing the floors of a corporate lobby. The caller ID showed a local law firm. I wiped my blistered hands on my janitor uniform and answered, expecting another aggressive debt collector hired by my ex-wife. Instead, a polite secretary informed me that my Uncle Henry had passed away from a sudden heart attack. She told me my presence was legally required at the reading of his will the following afternoon. Uncle Henry was the black sheep of my mother's side of the family. He was a fiercely independent, eccentric man who lived entirely on his own terms. While my relatives obsessed over country club memberships and luxury cars, Henry spent his life acquiring strange parcels of land and buying up liquidated businesses. My family largely ignored him, embarrassed by his worn flannel shirts and his habit of speaking his mind without a filter. But I had always liked him. When I was younger, he was the only adult who asked about my actual interests instead of my grades. We had lost touch over the last few years as I became completely consumed by the demands of my marriage and my corporate career, a career that was now entirely gone. Attending the reading meant giving up a shift at the warehouse, which meant losing $80 I desperately needed to keep the fake credit card debt from defaulting. But something told me I owed it to Henry to show up. The law office of Sterling and Croft was located in a towering glass high-rise downtown, just blocks away from where I used to work as a logistics manager. I parked my 10-year-old sedan in a cheap alleyway lot and walked into the pristine, marble-floored lobby. I was wearing the only suit I had left. It was deeply wrinkled from being stored in a trash bag in my back seat, and a faint stain still marked the right shoulder where Greg had intentionally poured scalding coffee on me just days prior. I took the elevator to the 40th floor and walked into the mahogany-paneled waiting area. My two cousins, David and Jessica, were already sitting on the leather sofas. David was a junior investment banker who wore suspenders without a hint of irony. Jessica ran a boutique public relations firm and was aggressively typing on her phone. When I walked in, they both looked up, their expressions instantly hardening into identical masks of disgust. They took in my scuffed shoes, my exhausted eyes, and my cheap suit. Neither of them offered a word of condolence about Henry. They just shifted slightly away from me as if poverty was a contagious disease. Before I could even find a seat, the elevator doors chimed and opened again. A man stepped out, projecting the kind of arrogant confidence that sucked the oxygen out of the room. It was Greg. My ex-brother-in-law adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit and smiled when he saw me standing there. The rage I felt was instantaneous and blinding. This was the man who had publicly humiliated me at my own church, the lawyer who had orchestrated my eviction, and the passenger who had treated me like garbage in my own car. "What are you doing here, Greg?" I asked, keeping my voice low so the receptionist would not hear. "This is a private family matter. You have absolutely no right to be in this building." Greg let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document with an official court seal stamped on the front. He shoved it directly into my chest, forcing me to catch it before it hit the floor. "I have every right to be here, Thomas," Greg said loudly, ensuring my cousins heard every single word. "Since you and my sister are technically still legally married until the divorce is finalized next month, any assets you inherit are considered joint marital property. Sarah appointed me as her legal proxy. I am here to make sure she gets exactly half of whatever loose change your crazy uncle decided to leave you. Honestly, considering the massive mountain of debt you racked up, she deserves every single penny." I stared at him, completely sickened by his relentless greed. They had already taken my house, my savings, and my career. Now they were hunting down the scraps of a dead relative just to punish me further. I wanted to hit him. My hands balled into tight fists at my sides, but I knew if I threw a punch, Greg would press charges and I would lose whatever tiny chance I had left at rebuilding my life. "Mr. Abernathy will see you all now," the receptionist announced, breaking the heavy tension in the room. We filed into a massive conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Mr. Abernathy was an older, very serious attorney wearing wire-rimmed glasses. He sat at the head of a long oak table with a thick file in front of him. We took our seats. Greg intentionally sat directly across from me, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with a smug, expectant grin on his face. Henry was a very private man. Mr. Abernathy began adjusting his glasses. But he was also an incredibly astute investor. His estate is far more substantial than any of you likely realize. He left very specific instructions regarding the division of his assets. My cousins sat up straighter, their eyes gleaming with sudden naked greed. Mr. Abernathy opened the folder. "To my nephew David, I leave my entire portfolio of blue-chip dividend stocks currently valued at $2.4 million. David let out a loud gasp of triumph, slapping the table with his hand. He looked at Jessica with a massive, arrogant grin. "To my niece Jessica," the lawyer continued smoothly, "I leave the sum of $1.8 million in liquid cash as well as the deed to the coastal property in Maine." Jessica actually squealed. She covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and pure joy. They had always treated Henry like he was an embarrassing burden, and now they were instantly millions of dollars richer because of him. Greg was practically salivating. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, staring directly at me with a predatory gleam in his eyes. He clearly assumed that if Henry had millions to give to David and Jessica, my share would be just as massive. I could practically see Greg calculating exactly how he would seize my inheritance, liquidate it, and hand it straight to Sarah and Richard Sterling. Mr. Abernathy turned a page in the thick file and looked directly at me. His expression changed, softening into a look of deep, uncomfortable pity. The entire room went dead silent. Greg stopped smiling. David and Jessica leaned in closer, waiting to hear what the family failure was about to receive. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as if the text on the page was somehow a typographical error he needed to verify. He looked directly at me with a profound, uncomfortable sorrow. "To my nephew Thomas," the attorney read slowly, his voice completely devoid of the celebratory tone he had just used to distribute millions to my cousins. "I leave the deed to the commercial property located at 442 Industrial Parkway, commonly known as the Oak Creek Plaza. I also leave him the sum of exactly $1. For a split second, the massive conference room was completely silent. Then a sound erupted from across the mahogany table. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a loud, hysterical burst of laughter. Greg threw his head back, his expensive Italian suit jacket shifting as he practically howled with amusement. David and Jessica immediately joined in, snickering behind their hands and exchanging looks of supreme satisfaction. "Oak Creek Plaza," Greg managed to gasp, wiping a tear of joy from his eye. "You have absolutely got to be kidding me. That is not an inheritance, Thomas. That is a financial death sentence." I looked over at Mr. Abernathy, silently begging for some kind of rational explanation. The older lawyer let out a heavy sigh, adjusted his tie, and slid a thick manila folder across the polished table toward me. "I am incredibly sorry, Thomas," Mr. Abernathy said softly, his eyes filled with genuine pity. "Your uncle acquired the property nearly 20 years ago, but it has been completely abandoned for the last decade. It is a derelict strip mall on the absolute worst edge of the industrial district." Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table, his eyes shining with pure, unadulterated malice. As a prominent local real estate attorney, he knew exactly what that property represented in this city. "Let me translate that legal jargon for you," Greg sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at the folder resting in front of me. "That property is a toxic, rotting wasteland. The roof on the main structure completely collapsed 3 years ago during a winter storm. The parking lot is a notorious dumping ground for rusted-out cars, shattered glass, and hazardous chemical waste. But that is not even the best part. I work closely with the city council, Thomas. I know exactly what is happening with that specific parcel of land." Greg aggressively reached across the table, grabbed the folder out of my hands, and flipped directly to the second page. He tapped his finger hard against a massive red-stamped document attached to the deed. "There is an active city demolition order pending on that strip mall," Greg announced loudly, ensuring my wealthy cousins absorbed every single detail of my absolute humiliation. "The local government has formally condemned the structure. As the new legal owner, you are now personally responsible for clearing the entire perimeter of rubble. But wait, the comedy gets even better. There are currently $30,000 in immediate municipal code violation fines attached to this deed. If those massive fines are not paid in full by the end of the financial quarter, the city will seize the land and place a permanent lien on whatever pitiful future income you manage to scrape together from your little janitor job." The room started to spin violently. I could not catch my breath. My Uncle Henry, the eccentric and brilliant man I had always deeply admired. The only person in the extended family I thought actually respected my character, had just handed me a crushing liability. I was already sleeping in my freezing 10-year-old sedan. I was already working 3 grueling physical jobs just to survive the fraudulent credit card debt Sarah had maliciously pinned on me. Now I was inheriting a condemned pile of crumbling bricks and another $30,000 in immediate municipal fines. I was being buried alive. My cousin Jessica shook her head, her face twisted in a mask of absolute disgust. "I suppose trash always finds its way back to the dumpster," she muttered quietly, packing her new lucrative stock portfolio documents into her designer leather handbag. She and David stood up without offering another word to me, eagerly following Mr. Abernathy out of the room to finalize their multi-million-dollar transfers. I sat frozen in the heavy leather chair, staring blankly at the bright red demolition stamp. Greg stood up slowly, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket with a look of supreme arrogant satisfaction. He pulled out his luxury smartphone, typed a rapid message with his thumbs, and then slid the phone back into his pocket with a smirk. A second later, my own cracked phone vibrated heavily in my pocket. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. The screen lit up with a new text message from Sarah. She must have been eagerly waiting for an update from her brother. The message contained exactly 4 words. "Enjoy the rubble, loser." I stared at the glowing digital screen. The sheer calculated cruelty of it felt like a physical knife twisting deep between my ribs. She was currently wearing designer clothes paid for by the billionaire executive who had liquidated my entire career. She was sleeping in a luxury bed while I was washing dirt, blood, and warehouse blisters off my hands in a public gas station bathroom every single night. And now she was actively cheering for my total financial destruction from the sidelines, laughing at my pain. "I told you on Sunday," Greg whispered, leaning down across the table so his face was just inches from mine. "You do not belong in our world. You are a complete failure. Sign the deed over to the city tomorrow morning and walk away before you end up rotting in federal prison for unpaid debts." He turned on his heel and confidently marched out of the conference room, the sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, leaving me completely alone with the heavy folder. I sat in the empty glass high-rise for a very long time. The city traffic moved silently on the streets 40 floors below me, completely unaware of the man whose life had just been shattered again. I was completely trapped. I had absolutely no money to pay the code violation fines, no resources to hire a professional demolition crew, and no legal protection to fight the corrupt city council. The rational thing to do was exactly what Greg had forcefully suggested. I needed to surrender the ruined property, accept my ultimate defeat, and spend the rest of my miserable life paying off the debts my ex-wife had stolen from my future. But as I reached out to close the manila folder, my thumb brushed gently against the faded ink signature of my Uncle Henry at the bottom of the property deed. I thought about the man who had kindly bought me my first bicycle when my parents refused. I thought about the man who spent hours teaching me how to patiently fix a broken lawnmower engine when my own father refused to ever get his hands dirty. Henry was deeply eccentric, but he was incredibly calculated. He spent his entire life quietly buying liquidated assets that other people considered worthless, and he always turned a massive profit. He did not make foolish mistakes when it came to real estate. He knew exactly what he was doing. I looked down at my blistered, calloused hands. Greg and Sarah desperately wanted me to surrender. They wanted me to look at a broken, condemned structure and see absolutely nothing but a reflection of my own ruined life. They expected me to run away because that is exactly what a coward would do. I picked up the heavy deed, folded it carefully, and slid it into the inner pocket of my cheap, coffee-stained suit jacket. I did not have a warm home, I did not have a respected career, and I did not have a single dime to my name. But I now owned a condemned strip mall on the edge of town. I was going to find out exactly why Henry left it to me, even if I had to tear down every single rotting brick with my own bare hands. I would not let them win. The morning after the will reading, I parked my beaten sedan across the street from the property at 442 Industrial Parkway. A heavy gray sky hung over the city, matching the absolute desolation in front of me. Oak Creek Plaza was not just abandoned. It was a concrete graveyard. The main structure was a long, low brick building that had surrendered to the elements years ago. Weeds as thick as my wrist pushed through the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Discarded tires, shattered glass, and twisted metal littered the ground. At the center of the structure, the roof had entirely caved in, leaving jagged wooden beams pointing toward the sky like broken ribs. And right on the front door of the largest unit, a bright red notice from the city was stapled to the rotting wood warning of the pending demolition. Standing there in the freezing wind, every rational instinct screamed at me to get back in the car. Greg was absolutely right. This place was a massive liability. I was a man sleeping in a retail parking lot, eating cheap instant noodles and working 3 grueling jobs just to outpace a fraudulent debt. Taking on a condemned commercial property with $30,000 in code violations was financial suicide. I could literally feel the exhaustion settling deep into my bones. All I had to do was call the city clerk, surrender the deed, and walk away. It would be the easiest choice I had made in weeks. But as I stared at the bright red demolition notice, the easy choice suddenly tasted like ash in my mouth. I thought about Sarah sitting in her luxury apartment, paid for by Richard Sterling. I thought about Greg laughing hysterically in the mahogany conference room, completely certain that I would fold under the pressure. They had taken my career, my home, and my dignity because I had been too trusting and too complacent. If I walked away from this strip mall, I was proving them right. I was accepting the label of the pathetic loser they had stamped on me. I reached out, grabbed the corner of the bright red city notice, and ripped it completely off the door. That afternoon, I altered my brutal daily schedule. I finished my warehouse shift, drove my rideshare route until the early evening, and took my meager cash tips directly to a discount hardware store. I bought a heavy sledgehammer, a crowbar, thick work gloves, and a box of industrial trash bags. Instead of sleeping in the Walmart parking lot, I drove back to the ruined plaza. I parked my car near the collapsed roof, turned on the headlights to illuminate the debris, and went to work. I started with the parking lot. The physical labor was intensely agonizing. My body was already pushed to the absolute limit from lifting warehouse pallets and scrubbing corporate floors. Now I was spending my only free hours dragging rusted car parts, hauling soaked blocks of drywall, and filling heavy bags with shattered glass. The cold night air burned my lungs with every breath. The cheap work gloves I bought tore on the first night, leaving my palms exposed to jagged metal and splinters. My hands bled. The blisters burst and reformed into thick calluses, and my muscles cramped so violently I sometimes had to drop to my knees just to breathe. But a strange thing happened as the days turned into weeks. The grueling, brutal work stopped being a punishment and transformed into a fierce kind of therapy. Every piece of trash I hauled away felt like removing a piece of the toxic life I had left behind. When I swung the sledgehammer to knock down a rotting, unstable interior wall, I pictured the smug, arrogant face of Richard Sterling. When I dragged heavy bags of debris out to the curb, I imagined throwing away the crushing debt Sarah had chained to my name. For the first time since the corporate buyout destroyed my world, I was completely in control of my environment. Nobody could lay me off from this job. Nobody could forge my signature here. This broken, ruined stretch of concrete was mine, and I was bringing it back to life by the sheer force of my own will. By the third week, the transformation was undeniable. The parking lot was entirely cleared of hazardous waste. The shattered glass was swept away, and the rusted cars had been towed by a scrapyard that paid me a few $100s for the metal. The city inspectors drove by one afternoon, slowing down to stare in absolute shock at the progress. I stood in the center of the lot, leaning on my sledgehammer, and stared right back at them until they drove away. The biggest challenge was the collapsed roof over the central unit and old gutted laundromat. If I did not patch the massive hole before the winter snow arrived, the water damage would completely destroy the foundational supports, giving the city the excuse they needed to bulldoze the entire plaza. I spent an entire weekend scrounging for discarded corrugated metal sheets and solid wooden planks from a nearby construction dumpster. Late on a Sunday night, under the harsh glare of a portable battery-powered work light, I climbed a rickety aluminum ladder to the top of the structure. The wind howled around me, threatening to throw me off the edge. My fingers were completely numb, and my shoulders screamed in agony as I hauled the heavy metal sheets into place. I used a manual hand drill to secure the makeshift patches, driving screws into the remaining solid beams with every ounce of strength I had left in my arms. When the final metal sheet was bolted down, I sat on the edge of the patched roof and looked out over the industrial district. The property was still incredibly ugly, heavily scarred, and technically condemned. But it was no longer dying. I had stopped the decay. I wiped the sweat and dirt from my forehead with a bleeding hand and felt a deep, unfamiliar sense of pride settle in my chest. I did not have a warm bed, I did not have a clean suit, and I was still deeply in debt. But as I climbed down the ladder to begin inspecting the dark flooded basement of the old laundromat, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not a victim anymore. I was a survivor, and I was finally ready to fight back. The winter freeze was closing in fast. The most dangerous threat to the property was not the collapsed roof, but what lay buried beneath it. The central unit of the strip mall used to be a commercial laundromat. Years of neglect and a shattered main pipe had turned its basement into a toxic, freezing indoor lake. If that water froze solid, it would crack the foundation entirely. That would give Greg and his city council friends the legal right to bulldoze the plaza. I had $40 left to my name. I spent $35 of it renting an industrial water pump and a portable generator. I hauled the heavy machinery out of my trunk, dragged it across the cracked asphalt, and lowered the thick rubber intake hose directly into the black, stagnant water. I yanked the pull cord on the generator. The engine sputtered, choked on the freezing air, and roared to life. The pump began pulling the heavy water out of the basement, sending a thick stream of foul-smelling sludge out into the street drains. I sat on the top step of the basement stairs, wrapped in my thin winter coat, shining a flashlight into the dark void. I waited for 6 hours in the cold. I did not have a warm house to return to, and I did not have a family waiting for me. I just had the loud, rhythmic thud of the gasoline engine and the slow drop of the water line. Around 3 in the morning, the pump began to suck air. The loud, gurgling sound echoed through the empty concrete shell. I climbed down the wooden stairs, my heavy work boots sinking into 2 inches of thick, foul-smelling mud. The smell of decay was almost unbearable. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the massive room. It was filled with rusted washing machine drums and rotting wooden shelves. But as the light hit the far back corner of the room, something entirely unnatural caught my eye. The floor in that specific section was not flat concrete. It was slightly elevated. I waded through the thick mud, my boots splashing heavily in the remaining puddles. When I reached the corner, I dropped to my knees, ignoring the freezing sludge soaking through my pants. I used my bare, calloused hands to wipe away years of accumulated grime. Beneath the mud was solid, heavy-grade stainless steel. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I grabbed a broken piece of metal pipe and started scraping the rest of the mud away. I uncovered a massive reinforced steel hatch set directly into the foundation. It looked like the entrance to a submarine. It was completely waterproof, heavily bolted, and entirely out of place in a derelict commercial laundromat. At the center of the heavy hatch was a digital battery-powered keypad. I stared at the glowing green buttons, my breath fogging in the freezing air, a waterproof vault hidden beneath a condemned strip mall. My Uncle Henry had planned this perfectly. He knew the city would ignore the property. He knew the family would laugh at it. He hid his true legacy in a place only someone desperate enough to do the brutal punishing work would ever find. But I needed a code. I sat back on my heels, wiping the toxic mud off my face. I thought about the will. He had left my cousins millions of dollars in blue-chip stocks. He had left me a ruined strip mall, $30,000 in municipal fines, and exactly $1. The attorney had handed me a crisp, freshly printed $1 bill inside a blank white envelope. I reached into the inner pocket of my stained jacket. I had kept the envelope on me as a bitter reminder of my absolute bottom. I pulled the crisp dollar bill out and held it under the beam of my flashlight. I stared at the green ink, looking for a hidden message. Then my eyes locked onto the serial number printed in the top right corner. It was an 8-digit sequence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. I leaned forward, pressed my thumb against the cold metal keypad, and carefully typed in the 8 digits from the serial number. The small light on the panel flashed from red to a solid bright green. A heavy mechanical lock clicked loud enough to echo across the basement. I grabbed the cold steel handle, braced my boots against the muddy floor, and pulled with all my remaining strength. The vacuum seal broke with a sharp hiss, and the heavy door swung upward on hydraulic hinges. A rush of completely dry, climate-controlled air hit my face. I aimed my flashlight down into the cavity. Resting at the very bottom was a thick, waterproof lockbox. I lifted it out, my arms burning from the weight, and placed it on the elevated steel platform. I snapped the latches open. There were no stacks of gold coins or hidden cash. The box was filled entirely with neatly bound legal documents. municipal blueprints, and heavy parchment deeds covered in state seals. I sat down in the mud, completely ignoring the freezing cold, and began to read the documents. My Uncle Henry was a visionary who saw the future of the city decades before anyone else. The deeds in the box did not just prove ownership of the surface land for the Oak Creek Plaza. They were grandfathered, ironclad municipal contracts that granted the bearer exclusive ownership of the subterranean rights for the entire surrounding area. I unfolded a massive blueprint. The 500-acre industrial zone surrounding my ruined strip mall was currently being aggressively redeveloped into a massive tech district. I looked closely at the colored lines drawn beneath the surface map. According to these legally binding documents, I owned the exclusive underground fiber optic routing channels and the primary high-volume water cooling access pipelines for the entire tech sector. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Richard Sterling, the billionaire executive who had liquidated my career and stolen my wife, had just staked the entire future of his conglomerate on building the largest data processing center in the Midwest. The new Sterling Tech data center was being built exactly 1 block away. But a massive server farm cannot function without deep-ground fiber optic routing and immense amounts of municipal water for the cooling towers. And according to the heavy parchment deeds resting in my freezing, muddy hands, I owned the exclusive rights to both. Richard Sterling could build his billion-dollar glass towers, but without my permission he could not turn them on. I carefully packed the documents back into the lockbox, sealed it tight, and stood up. I was entirely covered in toxic sludge. My muscles were screaming in pain, and my bank account was completely empty. But as I climbed the wooden stairs out of that freezing basement, I was no longer a victim. I was the man holding the keys to the entire kingdom, and I was about to make them pay for every single ounce of my suffering. The freezing wind howled through the cracked walls of the Oak Creek Plaza, but I barely felt the cold anymore. I sat on the floor of the gutted laundromat, my clothes soaked in toxic sludge from the flooded basement, staring at the waterproof lockbox resting in my lap. For weeks I had allowed my ex-wife Sarah and her arrogant brother Greg to convince me that this property was a financial death sentence. I had broken my back hauling trash and patching the collapsed roof, driven only by a desperate refusal to surrender. Now, under the harsh white beam of my battery-powered work light, the absolute brilliance of my Uncle Henry was unfolding right in front of my calloused hands. I carefully opened the heavy lockbox and lifted out a stack of large folded municipal blueprints. The parchment was thick and perfectly preserved, completely untouched by the decay of the building above it. I cleared a space on the cracked concrete floor, sweeping away decades of dust, and spread the massive documents out flat. They were incredibly complex legal blueprints detailing the subterranean infrastructure of the entire industrial district. At first glance, it just looked like a chaotic web of lines and zoning codes. But as I traced my finger along the faded ink, the sheer magnitude of what I was looking at began to crystallize in my mind. Uncle Henry had not just purchased a cheap strip mall on the edge of town. He had played a master game of geographic chess. The blueprints proved that this specific parcel of land sat directly over the main arterial junction for the entire 500-acre zone. According to the grandfathered ironclad deeds resting in my hands, the legal owner of Oak Creek Plaza possessed the exclusive subterranean fiber optic routing rights for the surrounding area. Furthermore, the property held the primary municipal water access pipelines necessary for high-volume industrial cooling. My eccentric uncle had quietly bought the absolute foundation of the city infrastructure, knowing that one day the modern world would have to build right on top of it. I pulled a secondary folder from the lockbox containing recent city planning proposals and corporate zoning applications that Henry had meticulously collected before he died. My eyes scanned the documents, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. I read the name printed boldly across the top of a massive development permit. Sterling Tech. My mind raced back to that Friday afternoon in the corporate conference room, watching Richard Sterling stand at the podium and liquidate my entire department with a bored, arrogant smirk. He was the billionaire who had orchestrated my firing and stolen my wife. According to these documents, Richard Sterling had staked the entire $2 billion future of his company on building a massive state-of-the-art data center right next door to my ruined property. It was meant to be the crown jewel of his conglomerate, a sprawling tech hub that would cement his legacy and solidify his overwhelming wealth. But a massive server farm cannot just sit on a plot of dirt. It requires immense continuous amounts of cold municipal water to prevent the cooling towers from dangerously overheating. It also requires an unobstructed high-capacity subterranean pathway to run massive bundles of fiber optic cables to the main city grid. I looked intensely at the colorful lines drawn on the blueprints. The Sterling Tech property was completely landlocked by protected municipal zones on 3 sides. The only possible route for their water cooling pipelines and their fiber optic network ran directly underneath the Oak Creek Plaza. The realization hit me with the crushing force of a freight train. Richard Sterling could pour hundreds of millions of dollars into building his beautiful glass towers and importing his high-tech servers. He could buy off city council members and hire the most expensive corporate lawyers in the country. But without my specific parcel for water cooling and fiber routing, his entire $2 billion project was completely dead in the water. He had built his massive castle, but I secretly owned the only drawbridge. I sat back on the freezing concrete, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it echoing in my ears. I thought about Sarah packing her designer luggage, dropping that manila folder of forged credit card debt onto my chest, and telling me to enjoy the rubble. I thought about Greg publicly humiliating me in the center aisle of our church, using aggressive legal loopholes to force me out of my own home. They had systematically stripped away my career, my finances, and my dignity, entirely confident that a man like me would just quietly disappear into the background. They thought I was a pathetic broken loser who would spend the rest of his miserable life scrubbing corporate toilets to pay off their stolen wealth. Instead, they had unknowingly handed me the ultimate weapon. Richard Sterling was the arrogant king of his empire, but he was currently building that empire on a foundation of sand. Without my signature on a land transfer agreement, his new data center was absolutely nothing but an empty glass monument to his own spectacular failure. If he could not open that facility, his heavily leveraged company would default on its massive loans, and his entire $2 billion conglomerate would rapidly face catastrophic bankruptcy. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had genuinely smiled in months. The freezing temperature in the derelict laundromat no longer bothered me. The pain in my blistered hands and exhausted muscles completely vanished. I carefully folded the heavy municipal blueprints, placed them back into the waterproof lockbox, and locked the thick steel latches with a resounding click. I was no longer the desperate victim sleeping in a 10-year-old sedan. I was the silent owner of their future, and I was going to use it to win. The first letter arrived wrapped in thick, expensive paper. I found it taped to the patched front door of the old laundromat on a freezing Tuesday morning. It was a formal purchase offer from a company called Apex Holdings, LLC. They were offering $50,000 for the immediate sale of the Oak Creek Plaza. To a man sleeping in a 10-year-old sedan and eating instant noodles cooked over a portable camping stove, $50,000 sounded like an absolute fortune. But sitting in the cold driver's seat of my car, staring at the crisp corporate letterhead, I just smiled. I knew exactly who was hiding behind the fake company name. Richard Sterling was trying to buy the final piece of his $2 billion puzzle for absolute pennies. He thought he was dealing with a desperate owner. He had no idea he was dealing with the man he had already destroyed. I did not call the phone number on the letter. I did not send an email. I tore the expensive paper into tiny pieces and threw it into a nearby dumpster. Silence was my greatest weapon. By ignoring the offer, I was taking away the one thing men like Richard Sterling demanded from the world, which was complete control. But ignoring the letters did not solve my most immediate and terrifying problem. Knowing I held the underground rights meant absolutely nothing if the local government seized the property for unpaid debts. Greg had been very clear in that mahogany conference room. I had $30,000 in municipal code violation fines hanging directly over my head. If I missed the payment deadline at the end of the financial quarter, the city council would confiscate the land. Richard would then simply buy the plaza directly from his corrupt political friends, completely bypassing me. To win this silent war, my legal standing had to be entirely bulletproof. That meant I needed cash, and I needed it immediately. I doubled down on my brutal daily schedule. My body was already failing, but I pushed it far beyond any normal breaking point. I worked my midnight janitor shift, scrubbing floors until my shoulders burned with deep, agonizing cramps. I went straight to the warehouse at dawn, lifting heavy wooden pallets until my calloused hands cracked and bled into my work gloves. At night, I drove the ride-share routes through the worst snowstorms of the season, taking every single premium passenger request I could find. I completely stopped spending money on anything that was not absolute survival. My daily meals consisted entirely of cheap ramen noodles and black coffee. I stopped turning on the heater in my car while I slept, wrapping myself in 3 layers of cheap thrift store blankets to save every drop of gasoline. The physical pain of the freezing nights was agonizing. I woke up shivering uncontrollably, my breath forming thick white clouds in the cramped back seat. But every time I felt like giving up, every time the sheer exhaustion threatened to break my spirit, I pictured Richard Sterling and Sarah standing at our church looking at me like I was a piece of trash. I let the burning anger warm my blood. I was not just surviving anymore. I was quietly building a fortress right underneath their feet. 2 weeks later, a second letter appeared on the laundromat door. This one was from a different shell company, but the aggressive tone was exactly the same. The offer had doubled to $100,000. The text included a thinly veiled threat about the pending city demolition orders, suggesting that I was foolish for holding on to a condemned liability. Richard was getting impatient. His massive construction crews were already breaking ground on the neighboring lot. They were pouring concrete foundations for the massive glass towers, entirely unaware that their cooling systems had nowhere to go. I took the second letter, struck a match, and watched it burn to ashes on the cracked asphalt of my parking lot. I did not flinch. I just went back to work. Every Friday afternoon, I took my wages directly to the county clerk office downtown. I stood in line wearing my stained janitor uniform, ignoring the disgusted looks from the people around me. I walked up to the teller window and handed over thick stacks of small bills. $10 bills from rideshare tips. $20 bills from warehouse overtime. I paid down the code violation fines inch by agonizing inch. The clerks looked at me like I was completely insane, pouring my hard-earned cash into a ruined commercial graveyard. But they stamped my receipts anyway. With every single payment, my legal grip on the Oak Creek Plaza grew tighter and stronger. By the final week of the financial quarter, the corporate letters had turned into a desperate flood. They were offering $500,000 now. Lawyers were taping urgent notices to the brick walls demanding a meeting. Richard Sterling was bleeding money on construction delays, and his executives were clearly panicking. They still did not know my name because Uncle Henry had shielded the property behind a blind trust that I now controlled. To the Sterling tech billionaire, I was just a nameless, stubborn ghost who refused to bow to his massive wealth. On the very last day of the quarter, I walked into the county clerk office for the final time. I placed my last stack of crumpled bills on the counter. The clerk stamped the massive red file closed. The $30,000 in fines were officially paid in full. The city demolition order was permanently canceled. The property taxes were completely cleared for the next 5 years. I walked out of that government building with a receipt that proved my ownership was absolute and untouchable. The silent war was over, and I had won the high ground. Now it was time to let the enemy step directly into my trap. My silence was driving them insane. For weeks I ignored the escalating buyout offers from Richard Sterling's shell companies. I watched from the shadows as the massive construction crews next door began to noticeably slow their pace. the harsh reality of their landlocked situation finally sinking in. Richard had built his career on bullying people into submission. He was accustomed to flashing his wealth and watching ordinary citizens crumble under his corporate power. But this time, his aggressive tactics were hitting a solid brick wall. When Richard finally realized the strip mall owner won't sell, he decided to stop playing games and unleash his ultimate weapon. That weapon was Greg. Greg had built his legal reputation on aggressive real estate maneuvers and corrupt political handshakes. He thrived in the murky waters of municipal corruption. Richard unleashed Greg to use eminent domain and city council connections to condemn my property. If they could not buy the Oak Creek Plaza legally, they were simply going to steal it from me. The official notice arrived on a freezing Thursday morning, nailed to the wooden barricade over the laundromat entrance. It was a declaration of eminent domain. The local government claimed my parcel of land was urgently required for a public utility expansion. It was a thinly veiled lie. Everyone knew the utility expansion was a corrupt front to supply Richard's massive data center with the underground water and fiber optic routing it desperately needed to function. The city gave me exactly 48 hours to vacate before seizing the deed and handing it to a municipal trust. The financial compensation offered was laughably small, a mere fraction of what the raw dirt was worth. Standing in the freezing wind with that notice in my scarred hands, a wave of panic threatened to crush my chest. This was exactly how Greg had thrown me out of my home just months prior. He used complex legal loopholes to make me feel powerless. He wanted me to believe fighting back was pointless because the justice system was rigged. For a moment, the sheer exhaustion of working 3 manual labor jobs and sleeping in a freezing car nearly broke my resolve. I felt like a solitary man trying to stop a massive freight train with my bare hands. Then I remembered the waterproof lockbox sitting safely in the hidden cellar beneath my boots. I was no longer the naive husband who trusted his family blindly. I was a man with nothing left to lose. I climbed down into the dark basement, fired up my lantern, and opened the lockbox. I spread the heavy parchment documents across the concrete floor and began reading every line of text Uncle Henry had left behind. Henry was eccentric, but he was a paranoid visionary. He knew owning critical urban infrastructure would eventually attract greedy corporate vultures and corrupt politicians. He had spent years preparing for this exact scenario. Deep within the dense legal jargon of the grandfather deeds I found it. Henry had not just purchased the land and the subterranean rights. He had established a series of meticulous ironclad legal contingencies specifically designed to block any municipal seizure. The documents proved that the subterranean waterways running beneath the Oak Creek Plaza were officially classified as a protected historical aquifer under a strict federal environmental statute from the 1970s. Because Henry had filed the paperwork decades before the current city council took office, local eminent domain laws held absolutely no jurisdiction over the federal protection order. The trap was beautifully set, and Greg was walking right into it completely blind. On Friday afternoon, the City Planning Commission held a public hearing to finalize the eminent domain seizure. I took a rare day off from the warehouse, put on the only clean suit I owned, and walked into the grand municipal building downtown. I sat in the very back row of the gallery, keeping my head down. Greg was standing proudly at the front podium wearing a custom-tailored suit and smiling confidently at the council members. He spoke with smooth, practiced arrogance, completely unaware that the anonymous owner he was currently destroying was the exact same man he had publicly humiliated at our church. He passionately argued that seizing the derelict plaza was absolutely necessary for the progress and economic future of the entire city. The council members, clearly bought and paid for by Richard Sterling, nodded along eagerly with every word. They officially called for any final objections before stamping the seizure order. I stood up from the back row and walked slowly down the center aisle. The moment Greg saw my face, his confident smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning bright white. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. I simply approached the clerk desk and handed over a thick manila envelope containing certified copies of the federal environmental statutes and the grandfather deeds. I politely requested that the federal protections be entered into the public record immediately. The head of the commission opened the envelope, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. The color drained completely from his face. He looked at Greg in absolute panic, then whispered frantically to the city attorney sitting beside him. The legal reality was undeniable. The local council had absolutely no authority to seize a federally protected environmental zone. Any attempt to bulldoze the property would automatically trigger an immediate federal investigation into the City Planning Commission. The sound of a gavel striking the wooden block echoed loudly through the tense room. The eminent domain claim was officially dismissed on the spot. I turned around and walked out of the chamber without saying a single word to Greg. I had used Uncle Henry's meticulous legal contingencies to block Greg at the last second. Later that evening, while I was scrubbing the floors of my janitorial shift, my phone vibrated with a breaking news alert. The construction on the Sterling Tech data center had been officially halted indefinitely. Richard Sterling was reportedly infuriated beyond all measure. His corrupt political back channels had completely failed him. His shell companies were exposed, and his $2 billion project was now entirely paralyzed by a man he still believed was just a pathetic broken loser. The fortress I had built in the shadows was holding strong, and the billionaires were finally beginning to bleed. The heavy steel doors of the fulfillment warehouse rarely opened for anyone not driving a forklift. It was a place of loud grinding industrial noise, a concrete cavern where men and women broke their backs for $14 an hour. I was on the loading dock, my high-visibility vest soaked with sweat, manually shifting heavy wooden crates. My hands were taped to cover the bleeding blisters. The air smelled of diesel exhaust. It was my reality, a brutal grind accepted to survive. But on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, that gritty reality was suddenly interrupted by a jarring flash of completely unearned luxury. I had just dropped a heavy crate onto a staging pallet when I noticed the warehouse floor manager pointing toward the stairs. Walking up those grated metal steps looking disgusted by the dirt was Sarah. She was wearing a pristine white designer trench coat and holding a luxury handbag that cost more than my yearly salary. She sidestepped a puddle of motor oil, her heels clicking against the concrete. The other exhausted warehouse workers stopped staring in confusion at the wealthy woman trespassing in their world. I stood up straight, wiping sweat from my forehead. I felt no panic, no heartbreak, and no intimidation. I just felt calculated curiosity. The billionaires were clearly getting desperate if Richard Sterling was sending his stolen wife to do his dirty work. Sarah approached my workstation, her eyes scanning my stained clothes and exhausted face. She immediately put on a mask of profound condescending pity. It was the exact same look she used to give stray animals. "Thomas," she said, raising her voice to be heard over the hum of the warehouse machinery. "Look at you. This is absolutely heartbreaking. I had no idea things had gotten this bad for you." I did not move. I did not offer her a greeting. I just stared, letting the silence hang heavily between us. The noise of the machinery continued roaring around us, but my eyes never left hers. She sighed dramatically, reaching into her expensive handbag and pulling out a crisp white legal envelope. She held it out like she was offering salvation. "I came here because I actually care about what happens to you," Sarah continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I know the debt is completely overwhelming you. Greg told me about that toxic, ruined strip mall your crazy uncle left you. It is a total nightmare, Thomas. You are going to end up in federal prison when the city fines bankrupt you. But I talked to Richard. I begged him to help you for the sake of the good years we used to have." I looked down at the envelope, keeping my face completely expressionless. "Richard wants to help me. He is a very generous man." Sarah smiled, stepping closer, clearly believing she had me hooked. "He is willing to overlook the fact that the property is condemned. His company is offering a mercy buyout. $50,000, Thomas. It is more than enough to clear the code violations and pay down the credit card interest. You can finally stop breaking your back. Just sign the transfer agreement and the debt goes away." Richard will take that dirt off your hands and you can move on. I looked at the woman I had spent 7 years loving. I used to think she was the smartest person in the world. Now, standing under the harsh warehouse lights, the illusion was shattered. I saw exactly what she was. She was nothing but a pawn. She had absolutely no idea about the subterranean fiber optic rights. She had no idea about the municipal water cooling pipelines. She did not know Richard Sterling was bleeding millions in construction delays because a nameless ghost owned the foundation of his $2 billion empire. Richard had lied to her. He convinced her this was a charity mission, using her as a psychological weapon to secure the land he desperately needed to survive. She was standing there acting like a queen, completely unaware her new king was currently drowning. $50,000. I repeated slowly, letting the number hang in the air. It is a lifeline, Thomas, Sarah urged, pushing the envelope closer to my chest. Please, just take the money and walk away before you lose everything. I reached out, but I did not take the envelope. Instead, I grabbed the heavy wooden handle of my pallet jack. I looked directly into her eyes, stripping away every ounce of emotion, leaving nothing but cold, absolute authority. You forged over $100,000 in debt in my name, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the industrial noise. You abandoned me, you let your brother humiliate me, and threw me out into the freezing street to sleep in a car. Do not pretend you have a soul. Sarah blinked, her fake smile instantly vanishing, replaced by genuine shock. Thomas, you are being completely irrational. You have absolutely nothing. You are sleeping in a car. I am working, I replied coldly, turning my back on her and locking the pallet jack into place. And you are trespassing. Take Richard's little envelope and get off my loading dock before I call the warehouse security team to have you physically escorted out of the building. You are a pathetic, stubborn fool, Sarah shouted, her true vicious nature finally breaking through the fragile mask. You are going to rot in this warehouse for the rest of your miserable life while we enjoy our wealth. I did not turn around. I gripped the wooden handle, leaned my weight forward, and began hauling the massive crate down the concrete aisle. I heard the sharp, angry clicking of her designer heels retreating toward the metal stairs, fading away into the roar of the machinery. I smiled, feeling the satisfying burn in my muscles. The billionaires were terrified, and my silent war was just getting started. The flight to Seattle was the biggest financial gamble of my life. I had drained the last dollars from my meager savings, the cash I painstakingly hid away from grueling warehouse shifts and endless nights driving strangers in the freezing rain. I bought a cheap coach ticket on a red-eye flight, wearing the same faded suit I had worn to the disastrous will reading. My hands were heavily calloused and wrapped in white tape to cover burst blisters from hauling concrete and sweeping floors. When I landed, the relentless gray rain matched the cold determination burning inside my chest. I did not rent a car. I walked directly from the transit station to the towering downtown headquarters of Horizon Tech. They were the singular rival to Sterling Tech, the only conglomerate large enough and hungry enough to wage open corporate war against Richard Sterling. I did not have an appointment. I walked straight up to the immaculate marble security desk, my wet shoes squeaking loudly on the polished floor. The guards immediately moved to intercept me, assuming I was a lost vagrant. I did not back down. I pulled a single, heavily redacted photocopy of the subterranean fiber optic deed from my pocket and slid it across the cold counter. I told the head guard to send that exact image to the top floor directly to their chief executive officer, a notoriously ruthless visionary named Harrison Cole. I told them if Harrison did not want to see me within 5 minutes, I would walk across the street and sell the document to a foreign buyer. Exactly 4 minutes later, the private executive elevator chimed open and a frantic assistant rushed out to escort me to the top floor. The boardroom was an absolute masterpiece of corporate intimidation. A massive mahogany table stretched across a room wrapped entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the storm-battered city. 7 senior board members sat in high-backed leather chairs, staring at me with a mixture of profound confusion and aggressive skepticism. Harrison Cole sat at the head of the table, He was a sharp, calculating man who had spent the last decade losing vicious market share battles to Richard. He looked at my cheap, rain-soaked suit and then looked down at the photocopy resting on his desk. He demanded to know who I was and how I possessed a grandfathered municipal utility right that his own billion-dollar legal team had completely failed to uncover. I did not give them my name right away. I simply placed my battered leather briefcase onto their beautiful table and snapped the brass latches open. I pulled out the original heavy parchment deeds that my eccentric Uncle Henry had buried in the freezing mud of the old laundromat. I laid out the municipal blueprints. I laid out the federal environmental protection orders that completely immunized the Oak Creek Plaza from any corrupt eminent domain seizure. I watched the atmosphere in the room shift from arrogant dismissal to breathless shock. These were some of the most powerful financial executives in the country, and they were leaning forward, eyes wide, realizing they were looking at the ultimate weapon. I explained the situation with absolute clarity. I told them how Richard Sterling had arrogantly staked the entire $2 billion future of his conglomerate on building a massive data center exactly 1 block away from my property. I showed them the architectural flowcharts, proving that without my specific parcel of land for high-volume water cooling and deep-ground fiber routing, Richard possessed nothing but a useless glass monument. His construction was completely halted. His political connections were paralyzed by my federal environmental trap. His company was currently hemorrhaging millions of dollars every single day in delayed operational costs and massive loan interest. Sterling Tech was rapidly bleeding out, and I was the man standing directly on their oxygen hose. Harrison Cole leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He recognized a fatal corporate wound when he saw one. He immediately reached for his checkbook. He offered me $10 million in raw cash right on the spot to sign over the deeds and walk away. A few months ago, when I was sleeping in a freezing retail parking lot and eating cheap instant noodles, $10 million would have sounded like an absolute fantasy. It would have been more than enough to clear the fraudulent credit card debt Sarah had pinned on me and buy a quiet life. But I was no longer a desperate victim seeking a simple escape. I had broken my back hauling trash and patching a collapsed roof. I had suffered ultimate humiliation. I did not just want to be wealthy. I wanted absolute control. I looked Harrison directly in the eyes and firmly rejected his cash offer. The board members gasped, stunned that a man looking like a street sweeper would turn down $10 million. I pushed the deeds closer to him and laid out my true terms. I proposed a devastating reverse merger. I would grant Horizon Tech the exclusive, irrevocable land rights they needed to completely dominate the regional data market. But in exchange, I demanded massive equity in a brand new joint venture, and I demanded absolute executive control over that specific entity. I wanted the title of majority partner. Harrison narrowed his eyes, testing my resolve. He asked me what exactly I planned to do with this new joint venture if they agreed to give me the executive keys. I smiled, feeling the cold anger that had kept me alive all winter perfectly crystallize into a master stroke. I told him our very first order of business would be to aggressively buy up every single ounce of Richard Sterling's over-leveraged toxic corporate debt through anonymous proxy buyers. Because his data center was paralyzed, his stock was already quietly tanking. We would become his primary creditors. When the inevitable default happened, Richard would not just lose his company to a faceless bank. He would lose it entirely to me. Harrison stared at me in profound silence for a long moment. Then he stood up, extended his hand across the mahogany table, and agreed to destroy our mutual enemy together. I walked out of the Seattle airport and got right back into my freezing 10-year-old sedan. A few days ago, that car was a symbol of my absolute rock bottom. Now it was the perfect camouflage. The joint venture with Horizon Tech had officially closed. Massive waves of capital had quietly flooded into my newly established holding company. I was sitting on millions of dollars in liquid equity and held complete executive authority over the entity that was currently buying up Richard Sterling's toxic debt. But I did not drive to a luxury car dealership. I did not buy a mansion on the hill. I drove straight back to the commercial office building and pushed my heavy yellow mop bucket for my midnight janitorial shift. Keeping my life visibly identical was the most important move I could make. My grandfather once told me that arrogance makes people blind. Richard Sterling and my ex-wife Sarah were blinded by their own greed. They needed to believe I was entirely broken. So I continued wearing my worn work boots. I ate cheap instant ramen noodles for dinner. I let my beard grow out just enough to look exhausted and defeated. Every time Sarah drove past the industrial edge of town in her brand new luxury SUV, she saw exactly what she wanted to see. She saw a broken man hauling trash out of a condemned strip mall. She had absolutely no idea that the man sweeping the cracked asphalt was actively dismantling her billionaire boyfriend's entire corporate empire piece by piece. Through my new executive access at Horizon Tech, I could monitor the exact financial bleeding of Sterling Tech. It was spectacularly satisfying to watch from the shadows. Because Richard could not secure the underground water cooling and fiber optic routing from my land, his massive data center construction site next door had completely stalled. His investors were panicking. His loan interest was compounding daily at a catastrophic rate. He was desperately trying to keep the massive failure a secret from his board of directors. He needed a massive public relations stunt to restore investor confidence. He needed a grand stage to project strength he no longer possessed. And I knew exactly which stage he was going to use. Our 10-year town reunion was scheduled for the end of the month. It was the premier social event of the season, hosted at the most exclusive country club in the county. Sarah had been bragging about this event for an entire year before she abandoned me. It was going to be her ultimate victory lap. She and Richard planned to use the reunion gala to publicly announce the completion of the new data center, promising hundreds of local jobs and cementing themselves as the saviors of the town. I also knew they planned to use the event to publicly humiliate me one final time in front of every single person we grew up with. I spent the next 3 weeks meticulously setting the final trap. I worked closely with the Horizon Tech legal team to finalize the hostile debt acquisition. We purchased every single leveraged note Richard owed to the major banks. We did it quietly through a series of anonymous proxy buyers, so his financial officers would never trace the money back to me. By the week of the reunion, Richard Sterling did not just owe money to random financial institutions. He owed his entire corporate existence directly to me. One single signature from my desk could trigger an immediate default and liquidate his conglomerate entirely. I placed that final execution document into a clean leather folder and locked it in my glove compartment. When the evening of the reunion finally arrived, I stood in the bathroom of a cheap motel. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. I now had enough money to buy the entire motel and tear it down for fun, but I reached into my closet and pulled out the exact same cheap suit I had worn to my uncle's will reading. It was still faded. It was still slightly wrinkled from being stored in a plastic bag. I put on my scuffed dress shoes and adjusted my cheap tie. I wanted them to look at me and see a total failure. I wanted them to feel absolutely superior right up until the exact second the floor collapsed beneath their feet. I walked out into the cold air and drove my old sedan through the dark, winding roads toward the Oak Bridge Country Club. The sprawling parking lot was already filled with luxury sports cars and imported sedans. I parked my rusted car right between two pristine vehicles, completely ignoring the disgusted look from the valet attendant who rushed over to intercept me. I walked up the grand stone steps of the club. The air was filled with the sound of a live string quartet playing softly and the continuous clinking of expensive champagne glasses. I stopped just outside the entrance and took a deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs. For months I had silently endured their vicious insults. I had slept in freezing parking lots wrapped in thin blankets. I had bled on concrete warehouse floors for minimum wage while they laughed at my absolute misery. They thought they had broken my spirit and erased me from their wealthy world entirely. But tonight, the silent war was finally ending. Tonight, the man they called a pathetic nobody was bringing their empire to the ground. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the brilliant light of the ballroom, ready to let them spring their own trap. I scanned the room and saw the stage perfectly prepared for Richard, unaware that it would become the site of his absolute destruction. I stood quietly near the back wall, holding my cheap drink, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows and take everything. The grand ballroom of the Oak Bridge Country Club hummed with the sound of crystal clinking and the low murmur of wealthy conversations. I stood completely still in my faded suit, blending perfectly into the dark shadows near the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the room. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted meats, a sharp contrast to the damp concrete and toxic sludge I had spent the winter inhaling. For the hundreds of alumni gathered tonight, this was a celebration of 10 years of success. For me, it was the final quiet moment before the storm broke. The warm ambient lights suddenly dimmed, signaling the beginning of the main event. A brilliant white spotlight snapped on, hitting the center of the large wooden stage and illuminating a massive digital screen that proudly displayed the Sterling Tech corporate logo. The crowd fell entirely silent as Richard Sterling walked confidently up the carpeted steps. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that easily cost more than the annual salary of the warehouse workers he routinely fired. He carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who firmly believed he owned the world and everyone standing in it. Seated right at the edge of the stage at a prominently reserved VIP table was my ex-wife Sarah. She was wearing a stunning designer gown, her neck draped in diamonds, looking up at Richard with unblinking adoration. Sitting right next to her was her brother Greg, the corrupt real estate attorney who had orchestrated my eviction. Greg was already clapping enthusiastically, his face glowing with smug satisfaction. They were the local royalty holding court, completely convinced they had secured their place at the absolute top of the social hierarchy. They had traded my loyalty for billionaire status, and tonight was their ultimate public victory lap. Richard stepped up to the polished podium and tapped the microphone. A smooth, practiced smile spread across his face as he looked out over the sea of eager faces. He began his speech by welcoming the alumni, offering a few brief words of fake humility about how wonderful it was to return to this quiet town. But the false modesty vanished within seconds. Richard was not there to reminisce about high school memories. He was there to conquer the room. He quickly pivoted the topic to himself, launching into a highly rehearsed monologue about the explosive economic growth of his corporate empire. He threw around massive financial figures, boasting about aggressive corporate acquisitions and regional market dominance over the last financial quarter. Every single word he spoke was a calculated effort to project invincible strength. Standing in the shadows, I listened carefully to his grand presentation. I knew the absolute truth. I knew his company was secretly bleeding millions of dollars a day in severe construction delays and compounding loan interest. I knew his board of directors was terrified. But to the hundreds of people in that ballroom, Richard was a financial god. They hung on his every word, nodding eagerly, desperate to be associated with a fraction of his overwhelming success. Richard raised his hand, majestically gesturing to the massive digital screen behind him. The corporate logo faded away, instantly replaced by a sleek, futuristic architectural rendering of sprawling glass towers and massive concrete complexes. A collective gasp of awe rippled through the affluent crowd. Richard proudly announced that Sterling Tech was about to make the largest infrastructure investment in the history of our state. He called this new project the undisputed crown jewel of his corporate legacy. His voice swelled with dramatic pride as he promised the crowd that this massive new data processing center would put our quiet town on the map permanently. He promised the creation of thousands of high-paying local jobs, a massive revitalization of the industrial district, and a technological future built entirely by his own two hands. The audience was completely mesmerized. Greg was nodding vigorously, clearly anticipating the massive kickbacks he would receive for helping secure the local zoning permits. Sarah was beaming, looking around the room to ensure every single person saw her sitting directly next to the throne. The dramatic irony of the moment was almost suffocating. They were putting on a spectacular show. Richard spoke passionately about laying the unbreakable foundation of his new facility, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual physical foundation belonged to someone else. The crucial subterranean waterways needed for his cooling towers and the deep ground fiber optic routes required for his servers were legally owned by the man standing in the back of the room wearing a cheap suit. He was hyping up a $2 billion technological marvel that was currently entirely paralyzed by a single piece of heavy parchment resting safely in the glove compartment of my 10-year-old rusted sedan. Richard began building the tempo of his speech toward his grand finale. He told the captive audience that achieving true visionary status required a ruthless execution of strategy. He bragged openly that he had personally eliminated the weak links in his corporate chain over the past year, a direct and cruel reference to liquidating my logistics department and stealing my life. He genuinely believed he had crushed me like an insignificant insect. He had absolutely no idea that while he was picking out his expensive tuxedo for this gala, a newly formed joint venture holding company had quietly and systematically swallowed every single leveraged note his conglomerate owed to the major banks. He was standing proudly on a brilliantly lit stage, declaring himself an untouchable king, entirely unaware that his corporate debt had just been fully acquired by his greatest enemy. He was a puppet, putting on a masterful performance, completely blind to the fact that someone else was already firmly pulling the strings. As the crowd erupted into a deafening roar of thunderous applause at his grand promises, Richard prepared to officially unveil the final operational timeline. The trap was set perfectly. The tension in the room was at its absolute peak. They had built their fragile house of cards as high as it could possibly reach, and I was finally ready to step out of the dark and let the wind blow it all down. The thunderous applause echoed through the grand ballroom of the Oak Bridge Country Club, shaking the crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of wealthy alumni stood on their feet, their hands clapping in perfect unison for the man standing at the center of the stage. Richard Sterling soaked in their absolute adoration with a practiced, arrogant smile. He was the undisputed king of the evening, and everyone in the room wanted to be near his throne. I stood completely still in the dark corner near the heavy velvet curtains, entirely unnoticed by the cheering crowd. My faded, wrinkled suit blended perfectly into the deep shadows of the room. For long, agonizing months, I had imagined this exact night. I had scrubbed corporate floors until my hands bled and cramped. I had hauled heavy trash in the freezing winter rain. I had lived on cheap instant noodles while sleeping in the back seat of a 10-year-old sedan. All of that severe physical and emotional pain was about to culminate right here in this single room. As Richard raised his hands majestically to quiet the captive audience, the stage spotlight shifted slightly, casting a bright peripheral beam across the edge of the darkness where I was standing. That was the exact moment she finally saw me. Sarah was sitting at the highly coveted VIP table directly below the wooden podium. She looked absolutely radiant, wearing a stunning designer gown that undoubtedly cost more than my entire annual salary at the fulfillment warehouse. Her neck was draped in heavy diamonds, and she held a delicate crystal champagne glass in her perfectly manicured hand. She turned her head to whisper a comment to her brother Greg, and her eyes caught the subtle movement in the shadows near the exit. I did not shrink back into the darkness. I stepped forward just enough for the ambient light to illuminate my face. The triumphant smile vanished from her lips instantly. Her eyes widened in genuine breathless shock, which was very quickly followed by a harsh flash of absolute disgust. She whispered something frantic to Greg, handed him her champagne glass, and stood up quickly from her velvet chair. She moved through the affluent crowd with the aggressive, calculated purpose of a predator spotting wounded prey. The wealthy guests parted for her effortlessly, completely unaware of the silent, vicious war happening right beneath their noses. She walked straight toward my dark corner, her expensive heels clicking sharply and aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. She desperately wanted to crush whatever tiny bit of pride she thought I had left before Richard made his grand announcement to the town. She stopped exactly 2 feet away from me, invading my personal space with hostile intent. The smell of her expensive floral perfume was overwhelming, a sharp, bitter reminder of the luxury she had secretly stolen from my hard work for 7 long years of marriage. She looked me up and down slowly, her eyes lingering cruelly on the worn fabric of my cheap suit jacket and the scuffed, faded toes of my discount dress shoes. She let out a soft, mocking laugh that barely carried over the loud ambient noise of the excited ballroom. "Thomas," she said, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated condescension, "I honestly cannot believe you actually showed your face here tonight. I knew you were struggling and desperate, but this is a completely new level of pathetic." I kept my heavily calloused hands resting casually in my pockets. I did not show a single ounce of anger, fear, or intimidation. "It is a 10-year town reunion, Sarah," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and entirely flat. "I received an invitation in the mail, just like everyone else in this building." She shook her head side to side, a look of profound theatrical pity crossing her pristine features. "You do not belong in this world anymore. Just look at you. You are wearing a literal garbage bag. You are sleeping in a freezing car. You are completely bankrupt. Richard is about to announce the largest technological investment in the history of this city, and you are standing in the dark like a stray dog begging for scraps." Her cruel words were specifically designed to break my spirit entirely, to send me running out the back doors of the country club in tears. 6 months ago, those exact words would have worked flawlessly. 6 months ago, I would have been completely destroyed by the devastating sight of my beautiful wife wearing another wealthy man's diamonds. But tonight, her vicious insults felt completely hollow and entirely meaningless. I looked deeply into her cold eyes and saw exactly what she really was. She was nothing but a pawn in a game she did not even know was being played. She had absolutely no idea that the massive $2 billion data center she was bragging about was entirely paralyzed. She did not know that Richard was bleeding millions of dollars every single day in severe construction delays and compounding loan interest. She did not know that her arrogant billionaire boyfriend was secretly facing catastrophic financial ruin because a nameless, faceless ghost owned the municipal water and fiber optic rights directly beneath his glass towers. She was standing proudly on the top deck of a rapidly sinking ship, aggressively mocking the only man who held the keys to the life rafts. "I am just here to listen to the keynote speech," I said quietly, offering her a faint, highly knowing smile. "I hear Richard has a very big, very important announcement to make to the investors tonight." That calm, unbroken smile absolutely infuriated her. She desperately wanted me to beg for her mercy. She wanted me to look shattered and broken by her overwhelming success. She took a highly aggressive step closer, her voice dropping into a vicious, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You really think you can stand there and pretend you are not dying inside right now?" She sneered, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You stupidly refused Richard's generous mercy buyout for that toxic, ruined strip mall. Greg told me the City Planning Commission is going to legally seize it next week for your unpaid fines. You tried to fight us and you lost absolutely everything you had left. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable, lonely life scrubbing corporate floors and hauling warehouse pallets while we build an untouchable empire." She turned her body slightly, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly toward the brilliantly lit stage where Richard was eagerly preparing to load his massive digital presentation. "You are still a nobody, Thomas. Watch real power work." She did not wait for my response. She turned around sharply and walked confidently back toward her VIP table, her expensive designer gown flowing elegantly behind her. I stood completely still in the comforting shadows, my hand resting gently against the premium leather folder, tucked safely in my inner suit jacket pocket. Inside that secure folder was the finalized ironclad corporate execution document from Horizon Tech. The elaborate trap was now perfectly set. I took a slow, deep breath and turned my complete attention back to the stage, more than ready to watch real power work. The ambient light in the grand ballroom shifted as Richard Sterling raised his hands to command the attention of his audience. He stood at the polished wooden podium, the undisputed king of his fragile empire, completely unaware that his reign was measuring its final seconds. He smiled brightly, soaking in the admiration of the wealthy alumni, the local politicians, and his adoring new fiancée sitting in the front row. Richard adjusted his expensive tuxedo and leaned into the microphone. He spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who believed he was utterly invincible. He told the crowd true vision required bold execution. He boasted that his company had systematically eliminated every obstacle in its path to secure the future of this city. The crowd hung on his every word, completely mesmerized by his projection of absolute power. Behind him, the massive digital screen displayed the sleek corporate logo of his conglomerate. Richard raised a small black remote in his right hand. He announced that he was about to reveal the final operational timeline for the $2 billion data center that would cement his permanent legacy. He promised them a technological marvel that would change their lives forever. He pressed the button on the remote with a theatrical flourish, expecting the screen to display an architectural rendering of his sprawling glass towers. The screen instantly went completely black. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the affluent crowd. Richard tapped the small black remote again, his practiced smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He tapped it a third time, much harder, looking over his shoulder with a flash of irritation. He muttered something sharply to the audio-visual technicians stationed near the side of the stage, but the technicians were not touching their soundboards. They were staring up at the massive display in shock. The screen did not show a beautiful architectural rendering. Instead, a stark, glaring white document filled the massive digital display. It was a formal corporate execution notice. The bold black letters at the top of the document read, "Notice of immediate debt, default, and hostile asset seizure." The ballroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The guests stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the dense legal jargon flashing before their eyes. Sarah stood up from her velvet chair at the VIP table, her hands clutching her diamond necklace, her face draining of color. Greg stopped his enthusiastic clapping, his mouth falling slightly open as his legal mind rapidly processed the catastrophic words displayed on the screen. Richard slammed his hand against the podium. He demanded that someone turn the screen off immediately. He shouted that there was a security breach, a terrible misunderstanding, a malicious prank played by a jealous competitor. His voice echoed harshly through the silent room, stripped of its smooth arrogance, replaced entirely by raw, unfiltered panic. That was the exact moment the side doors of the ballroom swung open. A man walked confidently up the carpeted steps and stepped directly onto the stage, completely uninvited. It was Harrison Cole, the notoriously ruthless chief executive officer of Horizon Tech. He wore a sharp, dark suit and carried himself with the predatory grace of a wolf stepping into a pen of trapped sheep. Richard froze, his eyes widening in sheer terror as he recognized his greatest corporate rival. He demanded to know what Harrison was doing on his stage. He threatened to have security physically remove him from the building. Harrison did not even look at Richard. He simply reached out and took the microphone directly from Richard's trembling hand. He stepped to the center of the stage, facing the dead silent room. "There is no misunderstanding," Harrison Cole said, his voice cold, steady, and amplified across the grand ballroom. "And there is certainly no prank. As of 5 minutes ago, Sterling Tech failed to meet the mandatory liquidity requirements for its highly leveraged commercial loans. The construction of the new data center has been completely paralyzed by a failure to secure basic subterranean utility rights. Because of this catastrophic oversight, Sterling Tech has defaulted on all its debt obligations. A loud gasp echoed through the crowd. Richard stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the podium as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath his feet. My holding company has aggressively acquired every single one of those defaulted notes. Harrison continued, his eyes sweeping across the terrified faces of the wealthy investors. Sterling Tech is now entirely insolvent. The assets, the accounts, and the corporate infrastructure no longer belong to Richard Sterling. This company has just been acquired in a hostile takeover. The absolute destruction of Richard Sterling was total. He collapsed into a chair on the stage, burying his face in his hands as his billionaire empire evaporated into thin air. Sarah let out a sharp cry, realizing she had abandoned a loyal husband to tie her entire life to a penniless fraud. But Harrison Cole was not finished. He handed the microphone to a stunned technician and walked directly off the stage. He descended the carpeted steps and moved purposefully through the crowd. The wealthy guests parted for him instantly, creating a clear path. Harrison did not look at the local politicians. He did not look at Greg. He did not look at Sarah, who was trembling violently near the front table. He walked straight to the dark corner near the heavy velvet curtains, stopping directly in front of the man wearing a faded, cheap suit. The entire room turned as one massive entity, their eyes following the billionaire CEO. Hundreds of people stared in shock as Harrison Cole, one of the most powerful men in the corporate world, extended his hand toward me. I pulled my heavily calloused hand from my pocket and gripped his hand firmly. In front of the dead, silent room, Harrison Cole smiled, shook my hand, and said, "Welcome, boss. The acquisition is complete." The heavy silence in the grand ballroom felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Harrison Cole had just walked out the side doors, leaving the echoes of his hostile takeover announcement hanging in the crisp, conditioned air. The massive digital screen behind the wooden podium continued to blaze with the stark white corporate execution notice. For a full minute, nobody in the room dared to breathe, speak, or move. The wealthy alumni, the local politicians, and the affluent investors were completely paralyzed, their eyes darting rapidly between the glowing screen and the two men at the center of the spectacle. I stood near the heavy velvet curtains, my heavily calloused hands resting calmly in the pockets of my faded suit. I did not smile. I did not cheer. I simply watched the inevitable laws of gravity take hold of a man who believed he could fly without wings. Richard Sterling remained slumped in the chair on the stage, his face buried deep in his trembling hands. The smooth, arrogant confidence that had defined his entire existence was completely eradicated. He suddenly jerked his head up, his eyes wild and bloodshot with absolute panic. He frantically reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo and pulled out his luxury smartphone. His fingers shook violently as he swiped at the screen, desperately trying to log into his executive banking portals. He was trying to find a loophole, a hidden reserve, any remaining shred of the empire he had spent a decade building. But I knew exactly what he was seeing on that small glowing screen. Through my executive authority at the new joint venture, I had personally authorized the immediate freezing of all his corporate assets. Every single account was locked. Every line of credit was terminated. Richard had not just taken out a standard business loan to build his massive data center next to my property. He had acted with supreme arrogance. He had heavily leveraged his own personal founder shares, using his total ownership stake in Sterling Tech as collateral to secure the billions of dollars needed for the construction. Because I had permanently blocked his underground utility routing, his project had stalled, his investors had panicked, and his loans had defaulted. By acquiring those defaulted notes, my holding company had legally seized his collateral. Richard was not just fired from the position of chief executive officer. He was entirely stripped of his equity. The sweeping mansions, the private corporate jets, the massive stock portfolios, they were all instantly gone. In the span of 60 seconds, the untouchable billionaire had been reduced to a man with absolutely nothing but the expensive tuxedo currently resting on his shoulders. He dropped his phone onto the wooden stage floor. It hit the polished boards with a sharp, hollow crack. He looked out into the crowd of affluent guests, his mouth opening and closing silently like a drowning man desperately gasping for oxygen that was no longer there. Directly below the stage at the prominently placed VIP table, Sarah was experiencing her own catastrophic descent into reality. She was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. The beautiful designer gown she wore suddenly looked like a tragic costume. She stared up at Richard, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and dawning comprehension. This was the powerful corporate titan she had abandoned our 7-year marriage for. This was the man who had promised her endless luxury untouchable status and a life entirely insulated from struggle. I watched the color completely drain from her pristine face as the brutal truth crashed down around her. She had forged over $100,000 in credit card debt in my name to fund her secret lavish lifestyle. She had thrown me out into the freezing winter streets, openly mocking my desperation, completely confident that her new partner would shield her from any consequences. She had traded a loyal, hard-working husband who would have bled to keep her safe, and firmly chained her entire future to a man she believed was a financial god. Now she was looking at a ruined, penniless fraud. Sarah slowly raised her hand to her throat, her fingers brushing against the heavy diamond necklace resting against her skin. Those diamonds were bought with Sterling Tech corporate funds. The luxury apartment they shared in the city center was leased under the company name. The private cars, the first-class flights, the exclusive country club memberships, they were all tied directly to the corporate accounts that my joint venture had just legally seized and permanently frozen. She was completely tethered to a sinking ship with absolutely no lifeboats in sight. She slowly turned her head away from Richard and looked across the crowded ballroom, desperately searching through the sea of shocked faces until her eyes finally locked onto mine. I was still standing in the dark corner wearing the exact same cheap, wrinkled suit she had aggressively mocked just 20 minutes prior. But the dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. The affluent guests who had ignored me all evening were now turning their bodies toward me, parting slightly to give me clear space, looking at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep reverence. They had just watched the most ruthless CEO in the tech industry walk across the room, shake my hand, and call me his boss. They finally realized that the quiet man in the faded clothes was the undisputed architect of this entire corporate execution. Sarah stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The sheer magnitude of her fatal miscalculation was written clearly across every feature of her pale face. She had ruthlessly divorced a man she believed was a pathetic nobody, only to discover that she had actually thrown away the quiet architect of a massive financial empire. She had chosen the shiny, hollow exterior, and I had chosen the solid, unbreakable foundation. The glamorous world she had sacrificed her entire soul to enter was currently collapsing into dust right in front of her eyes, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. The heavy silence that had paralyzed the grand ballroom finally shattered into a chaotic wave of frantic whispers. Hundreds of affluent guests, who just an hour ago treated me like an invisible piece of trash, were now staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and absolute reverence. Harrison Cole had walked out of the side doors, leaving the crushing reality of his hostile takeover announcement hanging in the crisp, conditioned air. Richard Sterling was still slumped in his chair on the brilliantly lit stage, a completely broken man staring blankly at the digital screen that proudly displayed his total financial ruin. But my attention shifted downward to the VIP table. The local royalty was rapidly descending into sheer panic. Greg and Sarah were no longer the arrogant king and queen of the town. The impenetrable fortress of wealth they thought they had secured was crashing down around them, and they were completely exposed. Greg was the very first one to break. The smooth, confident real estate attorney who had orchestrated my eviction and laughed at my condemned inheritance suddenly looked like a terrified child. He shoved his way through the murmuring crowd, completely ignoring the wealthy politicians and investors he had spent all evening trying to impress. He rushed up to the dark corner where I was standing, his expensive custom-tailored Italian suit suddenly looking ridiculous on his violently shaking frame. His face was entirely pale, covered in a thick sheen of cold sweat. Thomas Gregg stammered, raising both of his hands in a frantic, desperate gesture of surrender. "Thomas, please listen to me. This is all a massive misunderstanding. Richard lied to all of us. He told me the eminent domain seizure was standard municipal procedure. I had absolutely no idea you were the one holding the subterranean deeds for the tech district. I am a victim of his corporate fraud just as much as you are." I looked at the man who had publicly humiliated me in the center aisle of our church, the man who had intentionally poured scalding hot coffee on my shoulder while I was working my third job just to survive. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I just looked at him with absolute freezing indifference. "You are not a victim, Greg," I said quietly, my voice cutting cleanly through his frantic excuses. "You are a corrupt lawyer who built a career on crushing people you thought were weaker than you. You used aggressive legal loopholes to throw me out of my own home. You tried to help Richard steal my land for pennies." Greg dropped to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor, completely abandoning his pride in front of the entire town. "Please, Thomas, I am begging you. I know the city council inside and out. I can help you navigate the new zoning laws for your joint venture. Just give me a job. I will do anything you need. Please do not ruin my legal practice." I leaned down slightly, looking directly into his terrified, desperate eyes. "I am not going to ruin your practice, Greg. The federal investigators looking into your corrupt city council deals will do that for me. You told me once in the back of my own car that I needed to remember who I was dealing with. Well, now you are dealing with me. Know your place." I stepped around him, leaving him trembling on the floor, but before I could take another step toward the exit, Sarah threw herself directly into my path. She was weeping hysterically, her carefully applied designer makeup running down her pristine face in dark streaks, completely ruining the illusion of her perfect life. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the lapels of my faded suit jacket, gripping the cheap fabric like it was her only life preserver in a violently crashing sea. "Thomas! Oh my God! Thomas! I am so incredibly sorry," Sarah sobbed, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "You have to believe me. Richard manipulated my mind. He promised me security, but he was lying the entire time. He forced me to sign those forged credit card documents. I was terrified of him. I never actually wanted to leave you. I always loved you, Thomas. We built a beautiful life together for 7 years. We can rebuild it. We can start over right now." I stared down at the woman I had once loved with everything I had. I remembered coming home to find her packing her designer luggage. I remembered her mocking my cheap clothes and cheering for my complete financial destruction. She was not crying because she felt guilty. She was crying because the billionaire she chose had just turned into a bankrupt fraud, and the man she discarded had just become the most powerful executive in the room. She was attempting to use my old loyalty to save herself from the brutal consequences of her own vicious greed. I gently reached up and removed her hands from my jacket. I did not hold them. I just pushed them away. "You were not manipulated, Sarah," I said, my voice projecting clearly so the surrounding guests could hear every single word. "You made a calculated choice. You chose the shiny hollow exterior because you thought it would give you power. You handed me a folder of forged debt and told me to try not to lose the house before the bank took it. You visited me at a freezing warehouse just to mock my labor." "Please, Thomas," she wailed, her legs giving out as she sank toward the floor, her heavy diamond necklace sparkling pathetically under the chandeliers. "I have absolutely nothing left. I am completely ruined." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity, no regret, and no sorrow. The ghost of the man who used to love her was entirely gone, replaced by the unbreakable foundation I had built with my own bleeding hands. "I am sure you will find a way to survive," I replied coldly. "Enjoy the rubble." I turned my back on her completely, I did not look back at Richard Sterling weeping on the stage. I did not look at Greg shivering on the floor. I did not look at Sarah sobbing into her ruined designer gown. I walked confidently through the grand ballroom, and the massive crowd of wealthy alumni parted for me like an ocean. They watched me with absolute awe as I walked out the heavy oak doors and stepped into the cool, crisp night air. I walked down the stone steps past the pristine luxury sports cars and unlocked my rusted 10-year-old sedan. I put the key in the ignition, pulled out of the country club parking lot, and drove away from them forever, leaving the billionaires and the traders to drown in the disaster they had created for themselves. The morning sun hitting the city skyline looked entirely different when you owned the foundation it was built upon. Just 24 hours after the gala at the Oak Bridge Country Club, the financial earthquake had completely leveled Richard Sterling's empire. I sat in the corner office of the Horizon Tech joint venture headquarters, looking down at a massive stack of legal documents resting on my mahogany desk. These were not the forged credit card statements my ex-wife had once used to destroy my life. These were the execution orders for a hostile corporate takeover. I picked up a heavy fountain pen and began the methodical process of dismantling a billionaire. Thomas liquidates Richard's remaining assets with absolute cold efficiency. I signed the transfer deeds that seized the sprawling glass towers Richard had tried to build. I authorized the immediate public auction of his private corporate jets, the heavily leveraged luxury vehicles, and the massive downtown penthouses he had purchased to project an illusion of untouchable wealth. The money from those liquidations flowed directly into our new holding company, erasing the toxic debt Richard had recklessly accumulated. When Richard liquidated my former logistics department years ago, he had done it with a cruel, arrogant smirk. I felt no such arrogance. I simply felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of balancing a scale that had been violently tipped against me. He had built a massive house of cards relying entirely on deception and intimidation, and I was simply letting the natural wind of reality blow it all down. With the corporate war officially won and the paperwork finalized, I turned my complete attention back to the piece of land that had saved my life. Oak Creek Plaza was no longer a condemned toxic graveyard on the industrial edge of town. I did not sell the property to a massive conglomerate to be paved over and forgotten. Instead, I poured my newly acquired capital directly into the cracked asphalt and the broken brick walls. He revitalizes the strip mall, turning it into a thriving community tech hub. I hired the best architectural firms in the state to completely redesign the sprawling property, but I gave them strict instructions to preserve the original structural bones of the building. I wanted the history of that physical space to remain entirely visible. Within 6 months, the derelict laundromat with the flooded basement was completely transformed into a state-of-the-art server facility, utilizing the grandfathered subterranean fiber optic lines and the massive municipal water cooling pipes my Uncle Henry had so brilliantly secured. Above ground, the ruined storefronts became bright open concept workspaces filled with high-speed internet and premium equipment. I did not lease these beautiful spaces to massive, soulless corporations. I offered heavily subsidized rent to local startup companies, independent engineers, and small business owners who were desperate for a chance to prove themselves. I created a sanctuary for people who possessed genuine talent but lacked the financial privilege to break into the industry. The parking lot where I had once dragged rusted car parts until my hands bled was now lined with electric vehicle charging stations and vibrant green landscaping. The Oak Creek Plaza had become the beating heart of the city's new economic future. Sometimes late in the evening, when the tech hub was quiet, I would walk through the illuminated corridors and trace my fingers along the exposed brick walls. I could still vividly remember the agonizing pain of swinging a heavy sledgehammer in the freezing winter wind. I remembered the blisters bursting on my palms, the bitter taste of cheap instant noodles, and the bone-deep cold of sleeping in the back seat of my 10-year-old sedan. I had been pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance by people who wanted to see me broken. But standing in the warm, brilliantly lit hallways of the empire I had built from the dirt, I realized that every single ounce of that suffering had been a necessary forge. He finds peace knowing he built his empire through grit and patience, not deceit. I did not have to look over my shoulder, wondering when my lies would catch up to me because I had never told any. I did not have to manipulate the people around me to secure my position. My wealth was not a fragile illusion maintained by aggressive lawyers and forged signatures. It was anchored deep into the bedrock of the city, secured by relentless physical labor, unwavering determination, and the quiet brilliance of an eccentric uncle who knew that true value is often hidden in the places no one else is willing to look. I still drive my 10-year-old sedan on occasion, completely ignoring the confused looks from the valet attendants when I pull up to high-end restaurants. I still prefer wearing a simple, comfortable jacket over a custom-tailored Italian suit. My bank accounts hold more zeros than I could ever spend in a single lifetime, but my internal compass remains permanently fixed to the reality of the working class. I know exactly how quickly everything can be taken away, and I know exactly what it takes to build it all back from absolute zero. Richard Sterling and Sarah were completely erased from my world. They faded into the bitter obscurity they had created for themselves, trapped in a prison of their own overwhelming debt and ruined reputations. They had chosen the shiny, hollow exterior, desperate for the world to worship their fake perfection. I had chosen the rusted, broken foundation willing to endure the brutal grind of the shadows. In the end, the shadows provided the ultimate protection, and the foundation provided an unbreakable throne. The silent war was over. The storm had finally passed, and the man they had thrown into the freezing rain was now the one who owned the sky. Standing on the top floor of the newly finished community tech hub, I looked down through the expansive glass windows at the quiet streets of the industrial district below. The evening sun cast a warm golden light over the freshly paved parking lot and the vibrant landscaped gardens that now surrounded the property. It was hard to believe that just a year ago I was standing in that exact same space staring at a collapsed roof and a massive mountain of shattered glass. Back then, the bitter winter wind cut right through my cheap clothes and my entire existence felt like an open, bleeding wound. I had been systematically stripped of my career, my home, and my marriage in the span of a single devastating weekend. The people I trusted most had forged my signature, saddled me with insurmountable debt, and thrown me out into the freezing cold. They expected me to simply fade away and die in the shadows so they could enjoy their stolen luxury without a second thought. But looking back now, I realized that the absolute worst moment of my life was actually the greatest gift I could have ever received. When my ex-wife Sarah dropped that thick manila folder of fake credit card bills onto my chest and walked out the door to join a billionaire, she did not just break my heart. She completely shattered the dangerous illusion I had been living in. I had spent 7 years trying to be the perfect husband, playing by the rules and bending over backward to satisfy a woman who measured my entire worth by the balance in my bank account. I thought providing a comfortable suburban life was enough to secure her loyalty. I did not realize I was sharing my home with a predator waiting for a better financial offer. Richard Sterling and Sarah were two sides of the exact same counterfeit coin, and her brother Greg was the corrupt lawyer who protected their hollow kingdom. They were entirely obsessed with the outward appearance of supreme power. They desperately wanted the custom-tailored suits, the heavy diamond necklaces, the exclusive country club memberships, and the fawning applause of affluent strangers. They believed that if they looked wealthy enough, the world would simply bow down to them and ignore their complete lack of character. But their grand empire was built entirely on a weak foundation of sand and lies. Richard used aggressive corporate leverage to fund his massive projects, while Sarah used deceit to fund her lavish lifestyle. They were absolutely terrified of genuine hard work. They viewed physical labor as a humiliating punishment. They laughed hysterically at me when I scrubbed corporate floors and mocked me when they saw my hands covered in calluses and dirt. What they completely failed to understand is that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with what you wear, or what you drive. True wealth is the unbreakable resilience you build when you are forced to survive at the absolute bottom of the world. When I was hauling heavy wooden pallets at the fulfillment warehouse until my muscles screamed in agony, I was not just paying off their fraudulent debt. I was forging a brand new version of myself. Every time I swung that heavy sledgehammer to tear down the rotting brick walls of this old strip mall, I was breaking down the weak, naive man I used to be. The painful blisters on my hands and the freezing, sleepless nights in the back of my old sedan were the heavy price of my true independence. My Uncle Henry understood this profound truth better than anyone else. He was a quiet, eccentric man who lived entirely on his own terms. He could have purchased a sprawling mansion to show off his success, but he chose to buy a derelict commercial property hiding the most valuable subterranean utility rights in the city. He knew that the most precious assets are never kept on display for the world to admire. They are buried deep in the dirt, waiting for someone with enough grit and patience to dig them up. He left me this condemned property because he knew I was the only person desperate enough and stubborn enough to do the brutal, punishing work required to uncover the truth. The greatest victory in all of this is that I never actually had to seek direct revenge. I did not have to hire expensive lawyers to destroy Richard Sterling, and I did not have to scream at Sarah or Greg to make them feel guilty. All I had to do was secure my foundation, remain completely silent, and let their own spectacular arrogance do the rest of the work. They were so blinded by their endless greed that they marched themselves right off a financial cliff. I just stepped out of the way and watched them fall into the abyss they created. Today I sit at the head of a massive joint venture that controls the digital infrastructure of this entire region. But the money is not what brings me peace. The peace comes from knowing exactly who I am. I know that if I lost every single dollar tomorrow, I would survive. I know how to sleep in a cold car. I know how to rebuild an entire life from absolute zero. That is a kind of supreme confidence that no billionaire can ever buy. Sometimes the people who laugh at you for standing in the dirt never realize that the dirt is hiding a gold mine. They choose the shiny exterior and the hollow promises while you are quietly building an empire right beneath their feet. Never let anyone define your worth based on your current struggle. The humiliation you are enduring right now is just the forge preparing you for the power you are about to inherit. If you have ever had to rebuild your life from zero while the people who broke you laughed, hit that like button. Drop a comment about a time you let your success be your revenge, and subscribe for more stories about karma.